Welcome, everyone, to Remembrance International's live conversation with Katharina von Schnurbein, European Commission Coordinator on Combating Antisemitism. Here's CEO Dan Mariaschin.
Hello, everyone. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Welcome to One-on-One with Remembrance International. Thank you for joining us today. I'm fortunate to have as our guest today Katharina von Schnurbein, the European Commission Coordinator for Combating Antisemitism. Since 2015, Ms. von Schnurbein has worked with EU member states, the European Parliament, civil society organizations like B'nai B'rith, and higher education institutions to strengthen policy responses to anti-Semitism and other forms of hate and discrimination in Europe. And in 2018, Ms. von Schnurbein was awarded the B'nai B'rith Human Rights Prize for her work in combating anti-Semitism. Katharina, thank you for joining us today.
With you again. Hi.
So before we start with specific questions about anti-Semitism in Europe and all that you're doing to combat it, maybe we should start with definitions. We know there is the European Union, but we also know the European Union is an organization of various components, and you are with the European Commission. So perhaps you can tell us about that, and then to talk about your role in the work that you do.
Yes, so the European Commission is, if you like, the executive branch of the European Union. It has the right of initiative to propose legislation that then goes to the Parliament and the Council of the EU member states. So the system is a bit different than in national systems where usually the Parliament has the right of initiative. In our case, it's the European Commission, and that is why it is important that this position is within the European Commission, because we can actually propose policies and legislation.
Well, you've worked in a number of different positions within the Commission, working with churches, faith groups, and others. But this particular position, which you assumed in 2015, is different. It was the first time that this position had been established. What was it when this, as we say, when this job was posted, what was it that attracted you to this kind of work? Because it's a major assignment, and Europe, with all of the Jewish history, much of it tragic, with all of that, and then the current challenges that we're having, there's a lot on your plate. So what was it that you said, I think this is a job that I'd like to do?
Well, on the one side, it did sort of continue on from my position as the advisor to the European Commission President on the dialogue with religions, because in that context, I had, of course, already contact to the Jewish world, especially the religious representatives. So in that sense, it followed on from it. But I think what was more important, I'm German, the discussions about the past, about the Shoah, about our responsibility in Europe, and also as Germans today, was always a topic, let's say, at our dinner table. And so I think it was more a question of responsibility, of wanting to be able to contribute something, and also the Jewish world, the Jewish culture has interested me for a long time. So that came together. And a third thing maybe that I realized only after was that it's a big advantage not to be Jewish to do this job, because I don't speak for myself, I speak for somebody else. And therefore, I think I have a good possibility to raise issues that may be a bit difficult and controversial at times.
Well, I know that you work very closely with the Jewish organizations, not only in Europe, but also here in the United States and in other places, and we deeply appreciate that. So let's talk now about the current crisis. We're in the coronavirus era, time, and the anti-Semites haven't taken time off from what they do, because we have seen this explosion of virulent anti-Semitism through conspiracy theories about the coronavirus and who's responsible for it. So it will be Israel or Zionists or Jews. We've seen it all over. A lot of it's on the on the internet, of course, because everybody is quarantined, but it's out there. We've also seen it in Iran, where officially top government officials are also engaged in that kind of behavior. What are we doing, and what can be done at this moment where everybody's inside? What can we do to combat this new strain of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I think when it comes to a crisis like this, it has been said several times, it brings out the best and the worst in people. We see that a lot of good things are happening, a lot of creativity, a lot of new outreach also, let's say, to the communities are coming closer in a way as well. And then we see indeed the old forms of anti-Semitism, the blood libels, the scapegoating, the conspiracy myths resurging in new forms. And it reaches from the virus is fake, it's a Jewish conspiracy, to the virus is real, but it's still a Jewish conspiracy. It's a Zionist plot to depopulate the world. We have horrible terms like the Holocaust, spread the flu to every Jew, these kind of things that are shocking. But we know, I mean, that anti-Semitism has not been away. It is now, in a way, we see it in a accelerated form resurging on the net, also because people spend much more time on the net now that we are in quarantine. What we can do and what we are doing, I mean, there are different strands that we have been exploring for some time. One is that with regards to hate speech on the internet, I think that the European region globally is the furthest advanced when it comes to ensuring that our legislation that prohibits hate speech when inciting to hatred and violence reaches beyond the real world also into the online world. So we have been negotiating with platforms and agreed a code of conduct with them in 2016, whereby they are agree to take down illegal hate speech according to this legislation that is Europe-wide within 24 hours. And there we've seen a lot of progress. However, this legislation or this code of conduct concerns the flagged content. So now we've moved on in a sense that conspiracy theories are not necessarily illegal hate speech. They don't necessarily directly incite to hatred and violence, and it makes it much more complicated to go against it, because of course we've battled for years and centuries for freedom of speech. We're not going to want to limit everything, to set boundaries that we would not want elsewhere either. On the other hand, we know that conspiracy myths were at the origin of a lot of the hate incidents and the attacks that have happened in the past years. I mean, also in the US, in Pittsburgh and Poway, the replacement theories, here in Halle, a right-wing extremist in Europe that attacked the synagogue. I mean, all these people, it wasn't necessarily only the hate speech that triggered their extremism, but before the conspiracy myths. So we need to treat this very concretely and heads on. We are speaking also now with the platforms with regards to conspiracy in more general terms, and also disinformation linked to COVID, because there is a lot of conspiracy also out there as to how to cure COVID, and well, the idea that you can or let's say also the wrong information about how it is being spread, and what kind of instruments and also what kind of products in terms of consumer protection can help. So all of this together with addressing with the platforms, they have promised to debunk some of these, I mean, to engage more and to invest more into debunking them, but we know that it will take time. And
yeah, well,
this is something that we need to accept.
Yeah, you mentioned Pittsburgh and Poway and Halle, and this is the ongoing conversation between Europeans and Americans about free speech. But of course, you know, our free speech is something protected by the Constitution and so forth. And yet we have the famous dictum, which is true and which is followed, which is there is free speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Yeah. And the internet has become the crowded theater where yelling fire can produce, unfortunately and tragically, a Pittsburgh or a Poway or a Halle. I'd like to move to another point. Yesterday was Yom HaShoah, which is the Jewish Day of remembrance for the victims of the Holocaust. But the trivialization and distortion and denial of the Holocaust, use of Nazi symbols, it continues and it persists. What do you think on an EU level can be done, or on national levels, to ensure proper Holocaust education and memorialization as a bulwark or as a means, as a vehicle of overcoming that particular threat? We have the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is the consortium of countries that are pledged to engage in Holocaust remembrance and education. But how do you see that picture in terms of confronting this? Is, you know, yesterday, I think that the various memorials that were carried out virtually on the internet were very moving, because you know, we were just at home and thinking about what happened. How do you see this?
Again, I think it's a larger picture with regards to knowing about the Holocaust and being educated about this. I think there is a significant lack at the moment, especially when it comes to young people. And that is something that we are addressing very actively with the EU member states. A declaration was passed in 2018 by unanimity, whereby the countries committed to drafting national strategies against anti-Semitism, of which education is a significant part. This is education in schools, but also informal education and also education with regards to newcomers to the society. And it is holistic in the sense that it's not only about the dark chapters about the Holocaust, but also about the culture of the Jewish community in Europe throughout the centuries, and also what it then means that anti-Semitism is rising again today. So this we are taking into in a holistic way. We had a big meeting in December with the member states for the first time, where we brought together the responsibility levels from member states with the Jewish communities to discuss, and in some cases, indeed, for the first time, among themselves, what is needed. And I think it's very important that this happens together with the Jewish community. But what is worrying, I think, is the Holocaust distortion is because it is more complicated. So outright Holocaust denial, most people will say, you know, you're crazy. We know, you know, it's been established, and there are historic facts. But distorting the Holocaust, either because you compare it to Israeli politics and policies towards Palestinians in an undue manner, and thereby belittle the abyss of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, or because you belittle the numbers or the way it happened, or that Jews in the end were responsible themselves, it's much more difficult to tackle. Another aspect is also that when it comes to Holocaust distortion and denials, the extremists quite easily unite over it. So they agree on little, but they can agree on Jew hatred and the fact that that the Jewish community, well, that Hitler should have finished the job in a way, and again, this is a conspiracy that we are seeing resurging now, and in fact, we had a so-called Zoom bombing in the Israeli embassy's commemoration in Germany on the 20th of April, where unknown people showed Hitler pictures and connected it with hatred against Israel and clearly right-wing symbols. And that the fact that it took 5 weeks to move from disturbing real gatherings, which we have also seen, also in Germany, but also elsewhere in the EU, disturbing commemoration of the Holocaust, and now moving it within 5 weeks on to the net, I think is very scary and has a direct impact. And I think this is the key fact, that it has a direct impact on the well-being of the communities. And that's why it is, again, something that we are addressing with the member states. I think that Holocaust commemoration, as it sounds a bit redundant, but actually it happens only if you make it happen. So we see that in some member states, there are, for example, Holocaust remembrance funds that organize and help organize local commemoration of the Shoah. And in the end, this will be the only way to really make sure that this commemoration continues. I think, there's nothing more moving than to talk to listen to someone who survived the Shoah. And in the end, I think all the efforts that are being done at the moment to digitalize their testimonies, to make them accessible, it is key to ensure that the memory will be kept. So it's a very concrete activities and funds that need to happen. We have on European level a European Holocaust Remembrance infrastructure, where we have linked on a platform virtually since 10 years the different research institutes and memorial sites to coordinate and to exchange their archives and also their activities. And we see that it's very productive to make sure that they can support each other in what they do and give access, for example, also to researchers who, or even within the EU at some stages, can be under pressure to not look properly into the history of a country. And we know that even legislation is being passed to try to prevent this kind of research. So we want to make sure that this research remains possible, and this platform is a good possibility. So on all levels, on the local level, on the research side, on the state side, and then also the educational curricula and so on, we need to tackle this, and we are doing it in parallel streams, let's say.
So I mentioned the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, as it's called, which developed a working definition of anti-Semitism. Because you referenced Israel, and in our community, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and other strains of anti-Israel rhetoric and behavior has become a serious and major problem. So the IRA definition has talks fairly specifically about where the line is crossed when you enter into, if you're saying that you compare Israel to Nazi Germany, or the checkpoints to the Warsaw Ghetto, or Israel to South Africa, all of those references, which we consider to be just another modern strain of anti-Semitism. But country after country, it seems, not as quickly as we would like, globally, are beginning to look at that definition, at least as a standard behind which they can work. Do you find that more and more countries are accepting this? And what do we need to do to move those who haven't to do so?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. You can't fight it if you can't define it. This definition has been crucial in making anti-Semitism visible and explaining it to political actors, to civil society actors, to the media, and to make sure that people understand not only the old forms of anti-Semitism, but also the various modern forms, and the ones that we have developed, in fact, after the Holocaust, namely Holocaust denial and Israel-related anti-Semitism. It's a tool that is non-legally binding. I think it's very important to know that, to recognize it, and to accept it, because there are attempts to say, well, this should become a legal tool. First of all, it's not written like that. The examples are concrete examples that are non-exhaustive and that are just examples. But they help to understand, as you said, where the red line is crossed. When it's about the existence of Israel, for example, then there is no doubt about the fact that something is anti-Semitic. If you don't want the Jewish people to live in their ancestral homeland, well, then there is an issue. But in other cases, it may depend on the context, and it may depend also on the background of the perpetrator. So for us, it's important to say also, because it is non-legally binding, it tells us what is anti-Semitic. It's a tool that before it existed, basically people who wanted to argue or had a gut feeling that something was anti-Semitic didn't have an instrument or a document to point to if they wanted to. Now they can say, according to this definition, it's anti-Semitic. You may think differently, but I think it is anti-Semitic. And at the same time, not everything that is part of the IRA definition is illegal. As I said before, in European legislation, hate speech is illegal when it is inciting to hatred and violence. And the same is true for the difference between hate crime and hate incidents. And it is important to see that. What the IRA definition does, it shows that there is an anti-Semitic bias at the beginning of a deed. And then the law must decide whether, in which categories this needs to be treated. And I know that's not something that is very comfortable in a way. I would also prefer, simply to eradicate all forms of anti-Semitic speech immediately. And but it is, I think, important to understand what this does. The advantage is that it is a tool that will advance public debate if it is used. And also the understanding of politicians. In my understanding, or in my experience also with working with politicians on this, is that usually they start acting when they understand it's not only about the Jews. It's about us, it's about our society, about our democracy, about our security. Suddenly this is when things move. And I think it is fair to say that also within the European Union, it's no coincidence that the post was created, by the way, together with a coordinator on combating anti-Muslim hatred at the time, after the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the Hiba Kasher in Paris, and then the attack on the Copenhagen synagogue, all in the same year. I think we have to accept we are operating in a political environment where things need to be triggered, and unfortunately the price has been high on that. We see that member states, when they accept the IRA definition, and by the way, this is also part of the declaration that member states passed, in which they promised to have these national strategies, is to use the IRA definition and to adopt it if they have not done so yet. So we see that eventually all EU member states will adopt this definition and will use it in their judicial system and their training for teachers, and to identify anti-Semitic biases, and then also to help with victim support, because that's important, that the victim doesn't have to explain at the police why they think that what they just experienced was anti-Semitic. The police has to understand this like they would understand racism, like they would understand other forms of hatred immediately. And that's, I think, very important, and that's why this tool is so crucial.
I would just say one more thing about what we just were discussing, and then move on to a final question. But I think there's a disconnect in Europe, because there are several European states and governments that are in our view hypercritical of Israel, and the issue of the BDS, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist phenomenon sometimes is not factored into the thinking of some European leaders and some European governments. And there's I think oftentimes either a misunderstanding or maybe a non-recognition of our sensitivity, why we're sensitive to this. You know, we just talked about Yom HaShoah, and then the establishment of the State of Israel, and then to have folks out there who are talking about, who are delegitimizing and minimizing and marginalizing Israel, and worse, that this is the new anti-Semitism. And I don't think it's quite factored in, or it's quite filtered down, that words matter, and that one can have a relationship with Israel, and you can approve of this or not approve of that, but that what goes on in the name of delegitimizing Israel, demonizing Israel, can lead to some serious problems when it comes to anti-Semitism. We have time for one more question, and I think it's an important one. You know, we talk about the Transatlantic Alliance, which is something that B'nai B'rith has always been supportive of. We have a counterpart here in the United States, Ilan Carr, who's a good friend, who's our special envoy on combating anti-Semitism, based at the State Department. There are some other colleagues that you have in Europe who are working on these problems on a national state basis. Tell us a little bit about the sharing of best practices as you work this issue.
Yes, I think that this is this collaboration actually with the special envoys within Europe, but also obviously with Ilan Carr, also Israel, Canada, South Africa, other colleagues, is very important, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time we start something. We have regular meetings, usually twice a year. We'll see whether we'll do an online one.
Easy to do with Zoom. You can do it with Zoom. So.
Yeah, where we talk about the challenges that we face, knowing that our systems are different. The US, but it's very important to know also how we can support each other. You mentioned BDS. I think it's important for us Europeans to understand how the situation is to Europe, where in general, I think the BDS movement is much less prominent than it is in the EU. Been there against Israel is unacceptable. Of course, we value freedom of speech, but when it comes to boycotting Israel and to delegitimizing the existence of Israel, it's clearly unacceptable, and that is something that we are very attached to. We've also looked, when it comes to incitement, for example, into ensuring that, and I know this is contrary to what is usually portrayed, but that to projects that incite in any way, and that I think is important to know. And this was also has developed, let's say, in the context of exchange of best practice. We see that different countries have different strengths, but they also have very different systems. When it comes to the IRA definition, for example, the UK has adopted legislation whereby city councils and local authorities can get money easier when they have adopted the IRA definition. It's not to say that they don't get money if they don't adopt, but they can get it in a more in a better, quicker way. Then we see that, for example, France and Germany have passed legislation specifically on hate speech that goes beyond the European level. That is also something that we need to discuss now in the whole context of digitalization and algorithms and how hate speech is being produced. We see that when it comes to education and education material, Hungary has actually put together a consortium, and I think Maja-Britt was actually involved in this, to revise the curricula and the textbooks as to how Jews are being viewed in these textbooks throughout the history and also with regards to the Shoah. So it's important to connect these dots, and that's what we are trying to do now with the strategy. Also, we see that some countries are already quite far advanced. They have set up ministerial committees to make sure that they can actually write these strategies in a holistic way. We regularly put them to the fore to explain also to the others how this can be done. So I think this is a typical role of the Commission to coordinate these kind of efforts. And the same is, by the way, true with Ilan Kar. We have an excellent relationship. We very often co-chair these meetings because we think that it's important to strengthen also the transatlantic cooperation.
Well, Katharina, thank you really for all you do. Thank you for working with all of the organizations, with our colleague Alina Brickman in Brussels and so many others.
It's very good to
really
work with her.
Well,
and Hannah.
Well, we really are grateful for all of your efforts and for the great energy that you put into battling a phenomenon that unfortunately and tragically has been with us for millennia and has new strains here in the 21st century. So we thank you for all of that, and thank you for joining us today.
A pleasure. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Stay safe. We say stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to One-on-One with B'nai B'rith International. Please visit our website, b'naibrith.org, like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter and on Instagram, and lastly, tell a friend about us. For my guest today, Katharina von Schnurbein, I'm Dan Mariaschin. We'll talk to you next time on One-on-One on B'nai B'rith International.